It was a chilly evening, and the streets were bustling with people rushing home after a long day. Among them was a young woman, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand and her phone in the other. She had just finished her shift at work and was eager to get home, but something caught her eye. Near the corner of the street, a man sat huddled under a thin blanket, his face weathered by time and hardship. His eyes were downcast, and a small cardboard sign rested beside him, barely visible in the dim light. She paused for a moment, her heart tugging at the sight. She had seen homeless people before, but something about this man felt different. Maybe it was the way he seemed to shrink into himself, as if trying to disappear from the world. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity in his posture, despite his circumstances. Without overthinking, she walked over to him, her footsteps soft against the pavement. "Excuse me," she said gently, crouching down to his level. The man looked up, his eyes wary but kind. She noticed the lines on his face, each one telling a story she couldn't yet understand. "I just bought some food. Would you like something to eat?" For a moment, he didn't respond, as if he wasn't sure whether to trust her. But then he nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a warm sandwich she had picked up from a nearby deli. Handing it to him, she also gave him a bottle of water. "Here you go. I hope this helps." The man took the food with trembling hands, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. She smiled softly, feeling a mix of emotions, compassion, sadness, and a strange sense of connection. "Take care," she said, standing up to leave. But as she turned to go, the man spoke again, his voice stronger this time. "Wait," he said. "Can I tell you something?" She turned back, curious. "Of course. What is it?" The man hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he began, his eyes distant. "Someone who showed me kindness when I needed it most. I haven't seen her in years, but you have the same spirit." The woman felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. The man sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's a long story," he said. "But if you have a moment, I'd like to share it with you." She glanced at her watch. She was tired, and the thought of her warm bed was tempting. But something about this man's presence held her there. She nodded. "I have time." The man took a deep breath, as if preparing himself to revisit memories he had buried long ago. "Years ago," he began, "I wasn't always like this. I had a family, a job, a home. But life has a way of turning things upside down when you least expect it." The woman listened intently, her earlier fatigue forgotten. There was something about the way he spoke, his words carried a weight that drew her in. She sat down on the curb beside him, the cold concrete beneath her forgotten as the man's story unfolded. "I was a teacher," he continued, his voice steady now. "I loved my job, loved working with kids. But then my wife got sick, and everything changed. The medical bills piled up, and I had to make a choice, keep my job or take care of her. I chose her, of course. But without my income, we lost our home. And then, she passed away." The woman felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. She could see the pain in the man's face, the way his hands clenched around the sandwich she had given him. "After she was gone," he went on, "I couldn't find my way back. I tried, but the grief, it was too much. I lost everything, my job, my home, my sense of purpose. And now, here I am." The woman wiped a tear from her cheek, her heart aching for this stranger who had endured so much. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." The man nodded, his eyes glistening. "It's been a long road," he admitted. But moments like this, kindness from people like you, it reminds me that there's still good in the world." The woman sat in silence for a moment, absorbing his words. She had expected to give a meal and move on, but this encounter had turned into something far deeper. She felt a connection to this man, a shared humanity that transcended their different circumstances. "Thank you for sharing your story with me," she said finally. "It means a lot." The man smiled faintly, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Thank you for listening," he replied. "And for the food. You've given me more than you know." As she stood to leave, the woman felt a renewed sense of purpose. This chance encounter had touched her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She didn't know what the future held for the man, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never forget him. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The woman walked away from the encounter, her mind swirling with emotions. The man's story had left a deep impression on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than just a coincidence. She replayed his words in her head, his loss, his struggle, and the way he had thanked her for her small act of kindness. It made her think about her own life, about the things she often took for granted. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The man's face kept appearing in her thoughts, his voice echoing in her mind. She wondered where he was sleeping, if he was warm enough, if he had eaten enough. The sandwich she had given him felt like such a small gesture now, almost insignificant compared to the weight of his story. The next morning, she woke up with a resolve. She didn't know what she could do to help, but she knew she had to do something. On her way to work, she stopped by the same deli and bought another sandwich, along with a thermos of hot coffee. She told herself she would look for the man on her way home, hoping he would still be in the same spot. The day dragged on, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the man. Her co-workers noticed her distraction but didn't say much. She was usually so focused, so diligent, but today her mind was elsewhere. When her shift finally ended, she practically ran out of the office, the bag of food clutched tightly in her hand. As she approached the corner where she had met him the previous evening, her heart sank. The spot was empty. She looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but he was nowhere to be seen. Disappointment washed over her, and she felt a pang of guilt. Had she done enough? Should she have done more? Just as she was about to leave, she noticed a small piece of cardboard tucked under a nearby bench. Curious, she picked it up. It was the man's sign, the one he had been sitting beside the night before. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Kindness is never forgotten." The words hit her like a wave, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She didn't know why, but the note felt like a message meant specifically for her. She folded the cardboard carefully and placed it in her bag, a reminder of the encounter that had touched her so deeply. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about the man more and more. She started carrying extra food with her, just in case she saw him again. She even asked around the neighborhood, describing him to shopkeepers and passers-by, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Then, one evening, as she was walking home after a particularly long day, she saw him. He was sitting on a different street corner, his blanket draped over his shoulders, his head bowed. Relief and joy surged through her, and she hurried over to him. "Hi," she said softly, crouching down beside him. "I've been looking for you." The man looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. A faint smile crossed his face. "You're the kind lady from the other night," he said. She nodded, handing him the bag of food she had been carrying. "I brought you something to eat. And some coffee, too. It's cold out tonight." The man took the bag gratefully, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," she replied. "I've been thinking about you. About your story." The man's expression softened, and he gestured for her to sit beside him. She hesitated for a moment, then lowered herself onto the curb, ignoring the cold concrete beneath her. "You're a good person," the man said after a moment of silence. "Not many people would stop to help someone like me." The woman shook her head. "I think a lot of people would," she said. "They just don't know how to start." The man chuckled softly, a sound that surprised her. "Maybe," he said. "But you did. And that means something." They sat together for a while, the sounds of the city fading into the background. The woman found herself opening up to the man in a way she hadn't expected. She told him about her own life, her job, her struggles, her dreams. She talked about how meeting him had made her realize how much she had to be grateful for, and how she wanted to do more to help others. The man listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he smiled. "You have a good heart," he said. "Don't ever lose that." As the night grew colder, the woman knew she had to leave. But before she did, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She tore out a page and wrote down her phone number. "If you ever need anything," she said, handing him the paper, "please call me. I mean it." The man took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep this safe." As she walked away, the woman felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she had made a connection that mattered. Little did she know, that connection was about to lead her down a path she could never have imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the woman found herself thinking about the man often. She kept the piece of cardboard with his message, "Kindness is never forgotten," taped to her refrigerator, a daily reminder of their encounter. She continued to carry extra food with her, just in case she saw him again, but he never appeared. She even called the number she had given him once or twice, but it always went to voicemail. One evening, as she was walking home from work, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a text from a friend or a work email, but the number on the screen was unfamiliar. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice tinged with hope. "Is this the kind lady who gave me food?" a familiar voice asked on the other end. Her breath caught in her throat. "Yes, it's me," she said quickly. "How are you? Where are you?" There was a pause, and she could hear the man's labored breathing. "I'm not doing so well," he admitted. "I'm at the hospital. They let me use a phone to call you." The woman's stomach dropped. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'll be fine," he said, though his voice sounded weak. "But I was wondering, if it's not too much trouble, could you come by? There's something I need to tell you." Without hesitation, she said, "Of course. I'll be there as soon as I can." She hailed a cab and gave the driver the name of the hospital. Her mind raced with worry and questions. What had happened to him? Why had he called her, of all people? And what did he need to tell her? When she arrived at the hospital, she hurried to the front desk and asked for the man's room number. The nurse directed her to a small room on the third floor. As she walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoed in the quiet, sterile environment. She knocked softly on the door before pushing it open. The man was lying in a hospital bed, his face pale and drawn. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped rhythmically. But when he saw her, his eyes lit up with a faint spark of life. "You came," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I came," she replied, pulling a chair up to his bedside. "What happened?" He sighed, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "I got sick," he said simply. "The cold, the hunger, it caught up with me. A passerby found me on the street and called an ambulance." The woman felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Is there anything I can do?" The man turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "You've already done so much," he said. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been carrying with me for a long time." She leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What is it?" The man took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to speak. "When I told you about my wife," he began, "I didn't tell you everything. There's more to the story." The woman nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Before she passed away," he said, his voice trembling, "we had a daughter. A beautiful little girl. But when we lost everything, I couldn't take care of her. I had to give her up for adoption." The woman's eyes widened in shock. "I had no idea," she whispered. The man's eyes filled with tears. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he said. "But I wanted her to have a better life, a life I couldn't give her. I've thought about her every day since." The woman reached out and took his hand, her own tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry," she said. "That must have been so painful." He nodded, his grip tightening slightly around her hand. "It was," he admitted. "But there's a reason I'm telling you this. You remind me of her. Not in the way you look, but in the way you are. Your kindness, your spirit, it's like hers." The woman felt a shiver run down her spine. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. The man's eyes grew distant, as if he were looking into the past. "I don't know," he said. "I lost touch with her after she was adopted. But I've always hoped that she's out there somewhere, living a good life. And I've always hoped that one day, I'd get to see her again." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The woman didn't know what to say. She felt honored that he had shared this deeply personal part of his life with her, but she also felt a profound sadness for all that he had lost. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "It means a lot that you trust me with this." The man smiled faintly, his eyes closing for a moment. "You've been a light in my life," he said. "And I wanted you to know why." As she sat there, holding his hand, the woman felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this man's story end here. The woman stayed by the man's side for hours, listening as he shared more about his life. He spoke of his daughter, her bright smile, her love for drawing, and the way she would laugh uncontrollably at the smallest things. He described the day he had to say goodbye to her, his voice breaking as he relived the memory. The woman listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing a child, even if it was for their own good. When visiting hours were over, the nurses gently reminded her that she had to leave. She promised the man she would return the next day, and he nodded weakly, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion. As she walked out of the hospital, her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about his daughter. Where was she now? Was she happy? Did she ever think about the father who had loved her enough to let her go? That night, the woman couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts consumed by the man's story. She felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if his pain had somehow become her own. She didn't know what she could do to help, but she knew she had to try. The next morning, she called in sick to work. It wasn't entirely a lie, she felt emotionally drained, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had learned. She went straight to the hospital, stopping on the way to pick up a small sketchpad and a set of colored pencils. She didn't know if the man would feel up to drawing, but she thought it might bring him some comfort. When she arrived at his room, he was awake but looked even weaker than the day before. His face lit up when he saw her, though, and he gestured for her to sit down. "I brought you something," she said, handing him the sketchpad and pencils. "I thought you might like to draw. You said your daughter loved it, so I thought maybe you do too." The man's eyes filled with tears as he took the gifts. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. This means more than you know." They spent the morning talking and, at one point, the man began to sketch. His hands were shaky, but he managed to create a rough drawing of a little girl with a big smile. The woman watched in awe as the image came to life on the page. "That's her," the man said softly, his eyes fixed on the drawing. "My daughter." The woman felt a lump form in her throat. "She's beautiful," she said. The man nodded, his fingers tracing the lines of the drawing. "She was," he said. "She is." As the day went on, the woman found herself growing more and more determined to help the man in any way she could. She didn't know how, but she felt like she had to do something. When she left the hospital that evening, she made a decision. She would try to find his daughter. It was a long shot, she knew. She didn't even know the girl's name or where she had been adopted. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to try. She started by reaching out to a friend who worked in social services, explaining the situation as best she could without revealing too many details. Her friend was sympathetic but warned her that it would be nearly impossible to find the girl without more information. Undeterred, the woman began to research online. She looked up adoption records, searched for forums where people shared stories of reuniting with lost family members, and even posted a vague message on a few social media groups, hoping someone might have a lead. Days turned into weeks, and the woman spent every spare moment searching. She visited the man in the hospital regularly, bringing him food, books, and more art supplies. He grew weaker with each passing day, but his gratitude never wavered. He often asked her why she was doing so much for him, and she always gave the same answer: "Because you matter." One evening, as she was leaving the hospital, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a response to one of her online posts. Her heart raced as she read the message. "I think I might know who you're talking about," it said. "Can we talk?" The woman's hands trembled as she typed a reply. She arranged to meet the person the next day, her mind swirling with hope and fear. Could this be it? Could she really find the man's daughter after all these years? When she arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, she spotted a young woman sitting alone at a table. She looked to be in her early 20s, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. The woman approached her, her heart pounding. "Hi," she said, extending her hand. "I'm the person who posted about the adoption story." The young woman shook her hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I think I might be able to help," she said. "But first, I need to know more." As they sat down and began to talk, the woman felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what would come of this meeting, but she knew one thing for certain: she was closer than ever to giving the man the closure he deserved. The young woman at the cafe introduced herself as Mia. She explained that she had been adopted as a child and had spent years searching for her birth parents. When she saw the woman's post online, something about it had resonated with her. "I don't know if I'm the person you're looking for," Mia said, her voice tinged with both hope and caution. "But I'd like to help if I can." The woman felt a surge of gratitude. She explained the situation as best she could, careful not to reveal too many details out of respect for the man's privacy. She told Mia about his love for his daughter, his heartbreaking decision to give her up for adoption, and how he had never stopped thinking about her. Mia listened intently, her eyes glistening with tears. "That's a lot," she said when the woman finished. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been for him." The woman nodded. "It's been weighing on him for years," she said. "And now, he doesn't have much time left. I just want to give him some peace, if I can." Mia hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo. She handed it to the woman, her hands trembling slightly. "This is the only picture I have of my birth parents," she said. "It's old and faded, but maybe it will help." The woman took the photo and studied it carefully. It showed a young couple holding a baby, their faces filled with joy. The man in the photo was much younger, but there was no mistaking it, it was him. The same kind eyes, the same gentle smile. Her heart skipped a beat. "This is him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the man I've been telling you about." Mia's eyes widened in shock. "Are you sure?" she asked. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sure. This is him." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the discovery hung in the air, overwhelming and surreal. Then Mia broke the silence. I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I've been looking for him for so long. I never thought I'd actually find him." The woman reached across the table and took Mia's hand. "He's been looking for you too," she said. "Every single day." They sat together for a while, talking and crying and processing everything. Mia shared stories about her life, her adoptive parents, her career, her dreams for the future. The woman listened intently, marveling at the strength and resilience of the young woman sitting across from her. Finally, Mia took a deep breath and said, "I want to meet him. If he's willing, I want to see him." The woman nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "I'll talk to him," she said. "But I think this is exactly what he's been waiting for." That evening, the woman went straight to the hospital. The man was asleep when she arrived, his breathing shallow but steady. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand and waiting for him to wake up. When he finally opened his eyes, she smiled softly. "I have something to tell you," she said. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with curiosity and a faint glimmer of hope. "What is it?" he asked. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I found her," she said. "I found your daughter." For a moment, the man didn't respond. He just stared at her, as if he couldn't quite process what she had said. Then, slowly, tears began to stream down his face. Is she okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman nodded, her own tears falling freely. "She's more than okay," she said. "She's amazing. And she wants to meet you." The man closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The woman squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I'll arrange everything," she said. "Just rest for now. She'll be here soon." As she left the hospital that night, the woman felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she had given the man a gift more precious than anything else in the world. The chance to see his daughter again. The next morning, the woman woke up early, her mind buzzing with anticipation. She called Mia to confirm the arrangements, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. Mia answered on the first ring, her voice filled with equal parts excitement and nervousness. "I'll be there," Mia said. I need to know. Is he ready to see me?" The woman assured her that he was. "He's been waiting for this moment for years," she said. "You have no idea how much this means to him." Mia took a deep breath. "Okay," she said. "I'll be there this afternoon." The woman spent the rest of the morning preparing. She cleaned the man's hospital room as best she could, arranging a few small touches to make it feel more welcoming: a vase of flowers, a framed photo of his drawing of Mia as a child, and a stack of blank paper and colored pencils in case he felt up to sketching. She wanted everything to be perfect, or as close to perfect as it could be under the circumstances. When Mia arrived at the hospital, the woman met her in the lobby. Mia looked nervous but determined, her hands clutching a small bag. "I brought some photos," she said, holding up the bag. "From my childhood. I thought, maybe he'd like to see them." The woman smiled warmly. "I'm sure he'd love that," she said. They walked to the man's room together, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. When they reached the door, the woman paused and turned to Mia. "Are you ready?" she asked. Mia nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. I've been ready for this my whole life, she said. The woman opened the door and stepped inside, Mia following close behind. The man was sitting up in bed, his face pale but his eyes bright with anticipation. When he saw Mia, his breath caught in his throat. Is that, he began, his voice trembling. Mia stepped forward, her tears flowing freely now. Hi, she said softly. It's me. For a moment, the man just stared at her, as if he couldn't believe she was real. Then he reached out a shaking hand, and Mia took it, her grip firm and reassuring. You're so beautiful, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Just like I always imagined. Mia smiled through her tears. I've been looking for you, she said. For so long. The man's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. The woman stood quietly in the corner, her heart swelling with joy as she watched the reunion unfold. It was a moment she knew she would never forget, a moment of healing, of closure, of love. When they finally pulled apart, Mia reached into her bag and pulled out the photos she had brought. She handed them to the man, her hands trembling slightly. I thought you might want to see these, she said. The man took the photos with shaking hands, his eyes widening as he flipped through them. There were pictures of Mia as a baby, as a little girl, as a teenager, and as a young woman. Each one told a story, a piece of the life he had missed but had always hoped she was living. You've grown up so well, he said, his voice filled with pride. I'm so proud of you. Mia smiled, her tears still falling. I had a good life, she said. But there was always a part of me that wondered about you. About where I came from. The man nodded, his own tears streaming down his face. I've thought about you every day, he said. Every single day. They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories and memories, and filling in the gaps of the years they had lost. The woman stayed with them, offering support when needed but mostly just letting them have their moment. It was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once, a reminder of the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. As the sun began to set, the man grew tired, his energy fading but his smile never wavering. Mia held his hand, her own eyes heavy with emotion. I'm so glad I found you, she said softly. The man squeezed her hand, his grip weak but filled with love. I'm glad too, he said. You've made me so happy. The woman stepped forward, her heart full. You've both been so brave, she said. And I'm so honored to have been a part of this. Mia looked up at her, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said. For bringing us together. The woman smiled, her own tears falling freely now. It was my privilege, she said. As she left the hospital that night, the woman felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain, she had witnessed something truly extraordinary. A reunion that had been years in the making. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Mia visited the man every day, spending hours by his side, talking, laughing, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. The woman joined them when she could, her heart swelling with joy every time she saw the bond between them grow stronger. It was as if they were making up for lost time, cherishing every moment they had together. The man's health continued to decline, but his spirit remained strong. He seemed at peace, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. One afternoon, as the woman sat with him, he turned to her and said, "Thank you." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I just did what anyone would have done." The man smiled faintly. "Not everyone would have gone out of their way like you did," he said. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could have given me. You gave me my daughter back." The woman felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm just glad I could help," she said. The man reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but filled with warmth. "You've changed my life," he said. "And I'll never forget that." A few days later, the man passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Mia by his side. The woman was heartbroken, but she also felt a sense of closure. She knew he had left this world with a full heart, finally at peace after years of pain and regret. At the funeral, Mia stood before the small gathering of people who had come to pay their respects. She spoke about the man, her father, with a strength and grace that left everyone in awe. "I didn't get to know him for very long," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But in the short time we had together, he showed me what it means to love unconditionally. He gave me up because he wanted me to have a better life, and that's the most selfless act of love I can imagine. I'll carry his memory with me for the rest of my life, and I'll always be grateful for the time we had together." The woman listened, her heart aching but also filled with pride. She knew the man would have been so proud of Mia, of the strong, compassionate woman she had become. After the service, Mia approached the woman and hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." The woman hugged her back, her tears falling freely. "I'm just glad I could help," she said. Mia pulled back and looked at her, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't just help," she said. "You changed my life. And I'll never forget that." The woman smiled, her heart full. "You changed mine too," she said. In the weeks that followed, the woman and Mia stayed in touch. They met for coffee, shared stories, and supported each other through the grief of losing someone they had both come to love. The woman felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her small act of kindness had led to something so profound. One evening, as she sat at home reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized how much her own life had changed. She had started out simply wanting to help a homeless man, but in the process, she had found a sense of purpose she had never known before. She had learned the power of compassion, the importance of connection, and the incredible impact one person can have on another's life. She thought about the man often, about his kindness, his resilience, and the love he had for his daughter. She thought about Mia, about her strength and her courage, and the way she had embraced the father she had never known. And she thought about herself, about how this experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully put into words. As she sat there, she reached for the piece of cardboard she had kept taped to her refrigerator, the one with the man's message, "Kindness is never forgotten." She traced the words with her finger, a smile spreading across her face. It was true, she realized. Kindness was never forgotten. It had the power to change lives, to heal wounds, and to bring people together in ways they never expected. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life. The woman stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were quiet, the world bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She thought about all the people out there, each with their own struggles, their own stories, and their own need for kindness. And she made a promise to herself, to never stop reaching out, to never stop caring, and to never underestimate the power of a simple act of kindness. Because sometimes, she knew, that was all it took to change a life.